It's April 2026. A brutal 40-day conflict between the United States and Iran finally seems to be over. A landmark peace deal is on the table, and then, within hours, that hope is just extinguished, blown away by an act of shocking violence. Today we're going to examine the anatomy of that crisis, how a fragile peace was deliberately sabotaged, and the catastrophic fallout that pushed the entire world to a very, very dangerous brink.
And it all began with this one number, 100. On April 8th, just hours after a ceasefire was declared, over 100 aerial bombardments struck Beirut. And get this, in a terrifying 10-minute barrage. This was not a skirmish. This was a full-on saturation attack on a densely populated capital city. The outcry was immediate, and it was global. This statement from UN Executive Director Mohammed Safa, well, it really captured that feeling of helplessness and outrage. He framed it as not just a tragedy, but as a flagrant violation of the laws of war, the foundational rules that are supposed to prevent these exact kinds of atrocities.
So, let's take a closer look at the events of what Lebanon has now called Black Wednesday. The numbers behind the humanitarian impact are, well, they're simply staggering.
The cost of this attack went far beyond the initial death toll. I mean, look at this data from Doctors Without Borders and the Lebanese Ministry of Health. On the very first day alone, over 350 people were killed. 1,500 more were critically injured. But look closer. The attack also decimated the city's medical infrastructure. 91 healthcare workers killed, 120 ambulances hit. This wasn't just an attack on people, it was an attack on the very capacity to save them.
The official justification from the Israeli Defense Forces was that they were neutralizing Hezbollah leadership. But that objective, it stands in stark contrast to what was actually happening on the ground. Surgeons in Beirut reported that 40% of the victims flooding their hospitals were women and children. That highlights a devastating gap between the stated military intent and the civilian reality.
To really understand the true gravity of Black Wednesday, we have to rewind the clock just a few hours. Because this attack, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened on the very doorstep of what was meant to be a historic peace.
This timeline just lays out the shocking sequence of events. On April 7th, a peace deal is announced. Less than a day later, on April 8th, Beirut is in flames. The timing? Well, it suggests this was no coincidence, but a deliberate act aimed at shattering the ceasefire before it could even begin.
So what exactly was this peace deal? It was called the Islamabad Peace Plan. After 40 days of brutal conflict, a nuclear-armed Pakistan stepped in to mediate. And what they produced was this, a 10-point framework proposed by Iran that was, quite remarkably, agreed to by the United States.
The terms of this deal were nothing short of extraordinary. The U.S. agreed to Iranian control over the strategic Strait of Hormuz. They accepted Iran's uranium enrichment program, they suspended all sanctions, withdrew combat forces, and even agreed to pay war reparations. Now, to be clear, these points reversed decades of American foreign policy. For Washington to agree to them, it just shows you how desperate the situation had become.
But what if this sabotage was predictable? What if a high-level official inside the U.S. intelligence community warned, explicitly, that this very peace deal would be targeted for destruction? This is Joe Kent, and just hours before the peace plan was made public, he released a video statement with a prediction that was, well, chillingly accurate. He said Israel would try to sabotage the deal. So who is Joe Kent, and why should his warning have been taken so seriously?
His credibility on this issue is immense. Kent wasn't just some official. He's a former Green Beret and a CIA paramilitary officer with over a decade of combat experience. At the time of the crisis, he was serving as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, the absolute heart of America's intelligence apparatus.
But he had actually resigned just a month earlier, in March of 2026, and his public resignation letter was a bombshell. In it, he claimed the war itself was based on a false premise. He alleged that Iran posed no imminent threat, and that the whole conflict was being fueled by deliberate disinformation coming from Israel. His warning on April 7th was the tragic culmination of that dissent.
So, the attack on Beirut and the total collapse of the peace deal sent shockwaves across the globe. The fallout wasn't just diplomatic, it was legal, it was political, and it pushed the entire region closer to a much, much wider war.
A key consequence was a renewed focus on the International Criminal Court. An arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had already been active since 2024. The charges include serious war crimes, like the starvation of civilians and directing attacks against them, and even crimes against humanity, like extermination and murder.
The sheer brazenness of the attack also shifted the calculus in Europe. Major powers, including France, Spain, and Italy, began openly discussing direct military intervention to protect Lebanon's sovereignty, and that threatened to draw NATO members into a direct confrontation.
The long-term impact on the ground in Lebanon is just devastating. This wasn't just about one day of bombing. The wider campaign has led to the destruction of nearly 38,000 homes and the displacement of over 1.3 million people, including 400,000 children. Observers on the ground have reported this is effectively creating a de facto buffer zone through territorial cleansing.
The diplomatic language became extraordinarily harsh. I mean, look at this statement from Turkey, a key regional power and a NATO member. It shows the depth of the animosity. Describing the Israeli prime minister in these terms and vowing to pursue accountability, it signals a complete breakdown of regional relations.
And so, we're left with this question. You have a peace deal brokered by a nuclear power that was deliberately shattered. You have the foundational laws of war being completely ignored. You have European powers considering intervention, and the world's highest court has issued warrants for war crimes. In an environment like this, what guardrails are even left to prevent this crisis from spiraling into a truly global catastrophe?